Jean-Pierre Melville's Army of Shadows wasn't just a French resistance film, it was a director's confession, made from lived trauma, destroyed by political hatred, and buried for 37 years because a single scene featuring Charles de Gaulle became radioactive poison in post-1968 France. Today, we're revealing 20 weird facts about Army of Shadows, the film Melville considered his most personal work, the film that French critics savaged so brutally it never reached American audiences until 2006, and the film whose director died never knowing it would be hailed as his greatest achievement. Let's dive into the shadows. Number 20, the opening scene. Melville changed on opening day. On opening day, Jean-Pierre Melville was still undecided whether the opening shot of German soldiers marching past the Arc de Triomphe should be at the beginning or the end of the film. He had switched it multiple times during editing. Finished prints hit theaters with the sequence at the end. Then, on opening morning, Melville made his final decision. According to film editor Françoise Bonneau, Melville personally drove her to each of the 6 cinemas showing the film in Paris. At every theater, she had to physically slice out the sequence from the final reel and cement it to the front of the film. 6 theaters, 6 prints. Hours before audiences arrived, Melville racing across Paris, a filmmaker so obsessed with a single creative choice that he couldn't let it go until the last possible moment. The final cut was literally being made as audiences bought their tickets. That opening image was so important to Melville that he made it the first thing French audiences would see. A punch to the face. An unavoidable reminder of national shame. Number 19, the May 1968 massacre. The timing of Army of Shadows' release couldn't have been worse. Fall 1969. Just over a year after May 1968, when student protests and strikes lasting 2 continuous weeks involved 11 million workers and nearly toppled Charles de Gaulle's government. De Gaulle was now despised as the betrayer of the May 1968 student uprising. And Army of Shadows contained one brief scene showing de Gaulle pinning medals on resistance fighters in London. Cahiers du Cinéma savaged the film. They branded it Gaullist propaganda, attacked it for perceived glorification of a president the left now hated. The film doesn't glorify de Gaulle. He appears for maybe 3 minutes, depicted with irony that makes clear his heroism wouldn't outlive the war's extreme circumstances. But critics didn't care about nuance. Politics destroyed the film. As one historian put it, the commentariat was apoplectic that a World War II espionage film should include a brief scene that involved Charles de Gaulle and was appreciative of him, adding fuel to the fire during the heady days when the former Free French leader was seen not just as a dinosaur, but as an enemy. Melville's most personal film, destroyed by political hatred over a 3-minute scene. Number 18, the 37-year American blackout. American art film programmers took their cues from Cahiers du Cinéma. If French critics hated it, it must be bad. Army of Shadows was not released in the United States until 2006. 37 years. An entire generation of American cinephiles had no access to what's now considered Melville's masterpiece. The film existed in a critical vacuum, circulating only in France and Britain, unavailable to discover unless you had seen it during its initial French theatrical run. In 2006, Rialto Pictures released a restored print in American art house and revival theaters. Critics went insane. The film appeared on nearly every major critic's Best of 2006 list, Best Foreign Film of the Year, for a movie made in 1969. The New York Film Critics Circle gave it Best Foreign Film. The National Society of Film Critics gave it a special citation. Roger Ebert called it one of the greatest films of the 60s. Metacritic scored it 99 out of 100. Universal acclaim. Reviewers from The New Yorker to Newsweek rallied around Melville's neglected masterpiece. Too bad the director had died in 1973 at age 55, never experiencing the tide turn for his most personal film. Number 17, Melville died thinking he'd failed. Jean-Pierre Melville died of a heart attack on August 2, 1973 at age 55, just 4 years after Army of Shadows' disastrous release. He died believing the film was a failure, that French critics had been right to savage it, that his most personal work had been rejected by his own country. The reconsideration came in the mid-1990s when Cahiers du Cinéma published a reassessment of Melville's work, particularly Army of Shadows. That led to the 2004 restoration supervised by cinematographer Pierre Lhomme and the 2006 American release. But Melville never saw any of it. Never knew that armies of cinephiles would call it his finest achievement. Never knew it would rank as one of the greatest war films ever made. Never knew Roger Ebert would write that rarely has a film shown so truly that place in the heart where hope lives with fatalism. Melville spent his final years making gangster films, retreating to safer territory after Army of Shadows' critical and commercial failure. Imagine dying believing your masterpiece was a disaster. That's what happened to Jean-Pierre Melville. Number 16, the cinematographer's daily struggle. Pierre Lhomme had to struggle to convince Melville of his naturalistic lighting scheme. Not struggle once, daily struggle. Every day of production was a battle. Lhomme later admitted that filming Army of Shadows was a daily challenge due to Melville's exacting approach. The director wanted something different, more stylized, more controlled. Lhomme wanted naturalism, desaturated color, low-light cinematography that captured the bleakness of the resistance. Eventually, Melville's attention to realism combined with Lhome's insistence on a cool, desaturated color scheme resulted in some of the most beautifully bleak images ever captured on film, but it took constant fighting to get there. Lhomme called Melville's tunnel vision what ultimately ensured the film's unique palette of grays was achieved. Translation: Melville was impossible to work with, but his obsessiveness produced greatness. The film's muted blues, greens, and grays weren't happy accidents. They were war wounds from a daily production battle between a visionary cinematographer and a controlling director who nearly sabotaged his own masterpiece. Number 15. The set was terrifyingly tense. Production sources described the atmosphere on set as very tense. Melville was a former resistance fighter making a deeply personal film about experiences that still traumatized him. Lino Ventura was giving the performance of his lifetime while dealing with Melville's exacting demands. The crew was caught between a director's impossible standards and subject matter that carried national shame. One account mentions that things were very tense on set, with Ventura's impassive expressions and clenched jaw possibly being a natural consequence of the on-set atmosphere as much as character work. There's even a question raised in later reviews. Was the relationship between Ventura and Melville really as contentious as it has been made out to be? The answer seems to be yes, but two old pros knew when and where to hold their grudges. Melville demanded perfection. He built his own studio to maintain complete control. He approached filmmaking like a warrior. His words, that intensity created masterpieces. It also created production environments where everyone walked on eggshells. Nobody enjoyed making Army of Shadows. They endured it, and the tension shows in every frame. Number 14. Melville wanted to conceal his Jewish heritage. Born Jean-Pierre Grumbach in Paris in 1917, Melville took his pseudonym for two reasons: tribute to his favorite American author Herman Melville, and to conceal his Jewish heritage. This isn't just trivia. This is survival. Melville fought in the French army, then joined the resistance after France fell. He fled to London, adopted his pseudonym, returned to fight in the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, and participated in Operation Dragoon, a Jewish man fighting Nazis who were hunting his people. After the war, Melville became obsessed with bringing the French resistance to the big screen. Not romanticized, not heroic. Real. The terror, the betrayals, the moral compromises. Army of Shadows is his most personal film because it's his most Jewish film, even though it never explicitly addresses that. The director making this movie was a Holocaust survivor who changed his name to stay alive. Every frame carries that weight. Every character faces the same question Melville faced. How do you maintain your humanity when the alternative is extinction? That context changes everything about how you watch this film. Number 13. Only 1.5 million French saw it in France. Army of Shadows sold just under 1.5 million tickets. A reasonable, if limited, commercial success. But context matters. This was France in 1969. This was a film about the nation's most sensitive historical wound. This was Melville's most expensive and ambitious project. 1.5 million admissions should have been a triumph. Instead, it was viewed as a disappointment. Critics had poisoned the well. Word of mouth was toxic. The film that should have been celebrated as a national treasure was treated as an embarrassment. For comparison, Melville's earlier gangster films had performed better critically and commercially. Army of Shadows was the passion project that nobody wanted. French audiences stayed away, not because the film was bad, because Cahiers du Cinéma told them it was Gaullist propaganda, and because confronting occupation and collaboration was still too painful. The film France needed to see was the film France refused to watch. Number 12. Real resistance fighters wrote to Melville. While French critics savaged Army of Shadows, Melville received something far more valuable: letters from real-life resistance members praising him for making an affecting and accurate film. People who had actually lived through what Melville depicted, who had faced the terror, made the impossible choices, lost comrades to betrayal, wrote to tell him he had gotten it right. The critics called it unrealistic, glorified, Gaullist propaganda. The resistance fighters called it true. Jeanette Vincent's film scholarship notes that Melville drew from actual veterans, including André Duavrain, who plays himself in the film. Melville recruited real resistance fighters as consultants and cast them in roles. These weren't actors playing heroes. These were survivors playing themselves. The disconnect between critical reception and veteran response reveals everything wrong with 1969 French film criticism. Critics cared about politics. Veterans cared about truth. Melville delivered truth and paid the price. Number 11, Melville estimated. Only 600 resistance fighters existed in 1940. Melville said something controversial. Don't forget that there are more people who didn't work for the resistance than who did. He estimated that in 1940, resistance members numbered a mere 600. 600 people in all of France. This was heresy. Post-war French mythology celebrated the resistance as a mass national movement. Millions of brave citizens united against occupation. De Gaulle built his political career on that myth. Melville called it a lie. Army of Shadows depicts a small group, always outnumbered, on the run, lacking resources, pushed to the shadowy edges of French society, unable to rely on most countrymen. Many French people collaborated with the Germans. Most were simply indifferent. This realistic viewpoint enraged critics who still believed in the mythology. The film arrived just as France was beginning to reckon with collaboration during the Algerian War, when the glorification of the resistance had become taboo. Melville was telling uncomfortable truths. France wasn't ready to hear them. His reward? Critical annihilation and commercial failure. Number 10, Françoise Bonneau plays a secretary in her own film. The film's editor, Françoise Bonneau, appears on screen as the secretary at the talent agency in Lyon. This is charming and practical. Melville often cast crew members in small roles, but the real story is Bonneau herself. She would win the Academy Award for Best Film Editing for Z the same year Army of Shadows released, 1969. 2 masterpieces, 1 editor, 1 Oscar win, 1 critical disaster. Bonneau worked on some of French cinema's most important films. She also happened to be the person Melville drove around Paris on opening day, physically cutting and resplicing prints to move the German march from the end to the beginning. That's what great editors do. They serve the director's vision even when it means racing around the city with a razor blade hours before screen time. Bonneau's work on Army of Shadows is invisible and essential. The film's patient pacing, its long takes building unbearable tension, its elliptical structure, all editorial choices that make the film work. She won an Oscar for Z. She deserved one for this. Number 9, Nathalie Delon has an uncredited cameo. Nathalie Delon, who made her big screen debut in Melville's previous film Le Samouraï, appears uncredited in Army of Shadows as the woman with Jean-François at the bar in Marseille. Blink and you'll miss her. She's barely on screen, but her presence links Army of Shadows to Melville's gangster films, the cool, stylish, fatalistic movies that made his reputation. Melville treated his resistance fighters exactly like his gangsters and hit men. They follow a strict code of honor. They're capable of ruthless violence. They operate knowing any encounter could lead to death. Casting Delon signals that connection. This isn't a traditional war film. It's a Melville film that happens to be about the resistance, Le Samourai's hitman. Jeff Costello and Army of Shadows' Philippe Gerbier are the same character in different contexts. Both embody Melville's philosophy. In extreme circumstances, survival requires becoming something less than human to preserve what's human. That's why Delon's cameo matters. It's Melville reminding you who made this film. Number 8, Melville said he excluded all realism. Here's Melville's most paradoxical statement. I had no intention of making a film about the resistance. So, with one exception, I excluded all realism. This from a director whose film feels more realistic than any other resistance movie ever made. What Melville meant, he wasn't interested in documentary accuracy. He wanted emotional truth, psychological truth, the state of mind of people living under constant threat of betrayal and death, the film's episodic structure, its muted color palette, its emphasis on procedure and routine over action. These aren't realistic. They're expressionistic. Melville channeling his gangster film aesthetics to capture the fatalism and dread of resistance work. Roger Ebert understood. This is not a war film. It is about a state of mind. Melville excluded realism to achieve something more true than realism. He made a film noir about the resistance, cold, patient, pessimistic, dominated by shadows and moral ambiguity. The critics who attacked the film for inaccuracy missed the point entirely. Melville was making art, not a history lesson. Number 7, the brutal towel execution. In the film's most harrowing scene, Gerbier and his men execute a traitorous informer by strangling him with a bath towel. They have no guns, no knife, just a towel, and the scene goes on and on. You watch these men struggle to kill someone with their bare hands in a cramped room. Nobody looks away. Nobody makes it easy. Melville refuses to avert his camera's vigilant gaze. He captures the unbearable intimacy of murder and the terrible spiritual and psychological toll suffered by those mired in combat. This isn't heroism. This is horror. These are ordinary men forced to commit an act that will haunt them forever. And Melville makes you watch every second. Critics attack this scene, too brutal, too uncomfortable, missing the patriotic uplift war films should provide. They were right about one thing. It's brutal. That's the point. Resistance work meant becoming a killer, living with that, dying with that. The scene works because it locates the aesthetic dignity in Gerbier's willingness to make and carry out the ugliest choices, a stark reminder that what war creates is not heroes or villains, but warriors who must live with what they have done. Number 6, the Gone with the Wind. Seen while in London, Philippe and the resistance chief attend a screening of Gone with the Wind. As they leave, Philippe lets a rare smile cross his face and the chief remarks, "The war will be over for the French when they can see this great movie. It's the only moment of levity in the entire film." A brief exhale, Melville interrupting the somber proceedings for giddy cinephilia. But it's also devastating, because you realize these men are so starved for normalcy that watching a Hollywood movie feels like paradise. Their idea of freedom is getting to see Gone with the Wind. Melville loved American films, westerns, gangster pictures, studio productions. He built his own studio because French producers wouldn't give him control. He channeled his love of American cinema into quintessentially French films. This scene is Melville acknowledging his influences. It's also him recognizing that cinema is what's at stake. The Nazis aren't just occupying France, they're stealing the right to enjoy life. One of the film's reviewers wrote, "American audiences now have a chance to see Melville's great movie, and hopefully they will not offer any resistance but rather surrender willingly to the filmmaker's sublime skills." The irony couldn't be sharper. Number 5, Simone Signoret steals the film. Simone Signoret plays Mathilde, a Parisian housewife who joins the resistance and becomes Gerbier's assistant. She doesn't appear until the second half. Then she owns every scene. Reviews consistently note that once Signoret's character enters, the film's episodic structure suddenly coheres. Her performance grounds everything. Her stoic fatalism reveals the grim realities women like Mathilde faced. The film's ending involves Mathilde in a scene so devastating that audiences in 1969 left theaters shaken. Contemporary reviewers note it as one of cinema's most brutally honest depictions of the cost of resistance. Signoret was the incomparable Simone Signoret, an international star who had won an Oscar for Room at the Top. She didn't need this role. She took it because Melville offered her something rare, a female character as capable and ruthless as the men, with none of the sentimentality usually reserved for women in war films. Mathilde isn't a love interest. She's not there for sex appeal. She's a resistance fighter who happens to be female, and that's what makes her shocking. Signoret understood what Melville was doing. So did audiences. Critics were too busy being political to notice they were watching one of the great performances of French cinema. Number 4, André de Wavrin played himself André Cornel Passy. De Wavrin appears in the film playing himself, an official of the Free France Intelligence Services based in London, not an actor playing De Wavrin, the actual man, the real Colonel Passy, one of the most important resistance organizers appearing in a fictional film, playing himself in scenes depicting real events he lived through. Melville recruited actual resistance fighters as consultants and cast them in roles. De Wavrin wasn't acting. He was remembering. Imagine the surreality. A man returning to a film set representing the rooms where he had once planned operations that could mean life or death. Where betrayal meant torture. Where every decision carried impossible weight. And now it's a movie set. With lights, cameras, actors pretending to be his dead comrades. The Criterion Collection supplements include footage from a 1969 French TV show featuring WWII discussing his experiences alongside Melville, novelist Joseph Kessel, and the cast. WWII talks about the film with the authority of someone who lived it. The critics dismissed Army of Shadows as inaccurate. Colonel Passy was standing right there saying Melville got it right. Who should we believe? Number 3, the color palette. Nobody wanted Melville decided to shoot Army of Shadows in color specifically to move away from novelistic retellings of the war. Then he and cinematographer Pierre Lhomme created the most desaturated, monochromatic color film ever made. Shot in varying shades of brown, green, and blue, the film looks like it has been drained of life. That was the point. Walter Watitz co-shot with Lhomme, and together they created what one critic called a drearily overcast color palette. And the film's dreary palette of gray and brown, descriptions meant as compliments. The Criterion Collection restoration, supervised by Lhomme, shows the film looks terrific. Or at least as terrific as the film's dreary palette will allow. It's beautifully bleak. Melville gives the film an authentic look. Only scenes set in London and on an aircraft carrier have a studio set appearance. Everything else feels like documentary footage despite being meticulously staged. The muted palette wasn't just aesthetic, it was political. Olivier's Henry Thieve used Technicolor pageantry. Hollywood war films were saturated and heroic. Melville chose gray and blue and brown because that's what terror looks like. Nobody wanted this approach. Lhomme had to fight for it daily. Melville resisted, then embraced it. The result is singular. War as depression, resistance as grief. Number 2, the opening shot required special permission. Melville had difficulty getting permission to shoot the opening shot of German troops on their daily march down the Champs-Élysées. 24 years after liberation, France still couldn't face the image of Nazis owning Paris. The wound was too fresh. Melville fought for it. This was the film's thesis statement. Occupation happened. Nazis goose-stepped past the Arc de Triomphe. You can't pretend otherwise. He got permission, and the shot is devastating. For a French audience in 1969, that first image had the shock effect Buñuel and Dali aimed for when they sliced through an eye in Un Chien Andalou. German soldiers, headed by a drum and bugle corps, goose-stepping across the Arc de Triomphe, making a sharp turn onto the empty Champs-Élysées, marching straight toward the camera frozen by the sight. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. The Nazis came for us. They marked their territory. They made us watch. The shot opens and closes the film. First as shock, then as ironic commentary, France emerged from occupation, but at what cost? This is why Melville spent opening day racing between theaters to move it from end to beginning. The film had to start with that violation, with that shame, with that unavoidable historical fact. France didn't want to see it. Melville made them see it anyway. Number 1, Joseph Kessel was writing about his own experience. The source novel was published by Joseph Kessel in London in 1943. During the war, while the outcome was still uncertain, Kessel wrote from experience. He had been a resistance member. The characters, the incidents, the moral dilemmas, all drawn from real events involving real people, many of whom died before seeing Allied victory. Kessel gave his story a guardedly optimistic ending because in 1943, optimism was necessary for survival. You couldn't write about the resistance failing when the resistance needed recruits. Melville, looking back 25 years later, understanding that most of the fighters Kessel depicted had died not knowing their actions contributed to victory, didn't allow anyone to get out alive. The novel and the film are the same story from different temporal positions. Kessel writing in the middle of the nightmare, needing hope. Melville writing afterward, knowing the truth. Both men were resistance members. Both were telling their own stories. The difference, Kessel was writing propaganda. Melville was writing tragedy. Kessel is best known for Belle de Jour, the novel Louis Buñuel adapted in 1967. But Army of Shadows was his most important work, a document of terror, hope, and sacrifice written while he was still living it. Melville took that document and made it immortal, then watched critics destroy it for daring to tell the truth. Jean-Pierre Melville's Army of Shadows should have been France's national masterpiece. A resistance veteran making an unsparing film about occupation, collaboration, and the tiny minority who fought while most French people looked away. Instead, it became a political football, destroyed by critics who cared more about Charles de Gaulle than cinematic truth. Melville died believing he had failed, never knowing his most personal film would be rediscovered, restored, and celebrated as one of cinema's greatest achievements, never knowing Roger Ebert would call it the best foreign film of 2006, never knowing it would rank #1 on countless critics' lists. The film he made about shadows spent 37 years in shadow, then emerged as undeniable proof that great art survives bad criticism, that truth outlives propaganda, that personal testimony matters more than political fashion.